Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. For the second half of our show, we're pleased to talk labor policy with author, analyst, and former chief economist of the U.S. Department of Labor, Diana Furchtgott-Roth, now a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Diana, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you.
Diana, we're here today to talk minimum wage and labor laws, and I'm mostly interested in the politics of the minimum wage. People have their views. Most are pretty solidified on whether they think it's a good idea or a bad idea. But what's happening now across the country? Why are so many red states voting to raise the minimum wage?
Well, that's a really good question, Bill, because you find that states such as Arkansas that went completely Republican have voted to raise their minimum wage to $7.50 an hour. And you ask yourself why, when costs of labor and wages are so low in Arkansas, why the state would do it to itself. And I think the answer is that when you put these measures on the ballot, people are fundamentally compassionate. People are fundamentally good. And if you put on the ballot, do you think people should get a raise? People vote yes. And they don't have to pay anything out of their own pockets that they can see. They're basically waving a magic wand, and they don't see any increase to themselves in costs. They don't see that they'll pay more for fast food at their local Burger King, for example. So they vote yes. They don't see any disadvantages.
Or maybe they believe that all the raises will come out of profits, so why should they have to pay more for their food?
Exactly. They basically think that it is a win-win situation. And one reason for that is that fewer than 3% of working Americans make minimum wage. So it's not a very big problem in terms of percent of the workforce.
Doesn't that make it pretty economically irrelevant what they do?
It's only relevant to young people and teenagers. Almost everybody else makes over minimum wage. But it's a very big problem to young people and teens who want to get their foot on the first rung of the career ladder. They're the ones who can't get their entry-level job. And that has not just economic ramifications, but vast social ramifications too. I'm sure you and many of our listeners remember their first job, which was probably in the fast food or restaurant industry. I know mine was when I was scooping ice cream at Baskin-Robbins, and I wouldn't have been able to have that job if the minimum wage had been really high.
Well, let me ask you about that. That's a good question. My first job was off the books, cash under the table. I was pumping gas for a friend of my family's who ran a gas station, and he was just happy to pay me out of the cash register. I ended up getting more than the minimum wage because he didn't have to pay any taxes. I didn't have to pay any taxes. How much of that's going on out there?
Well, I think probably a certain amount of it is still going on, and the fact that it's under the table means that we don't have good data on it. So I can't give you any good facts. What's more relevant is that you have people who are trying to go into business for themselves, and there's no minimum wage for that. So whereas your local teen might not be able to get a job at Burger King, she might try to start a babysitting service or a dog sitting service or something like that. And that wage that she would get would end up being less than minimum wage, and she wouldn't be able to get so many references to move on to the next step.
Why are so many unions fighting so vigorously for minimum wage when, as you say, this mostly applies to teenagers who are not union members, and most union members don't make minimum wage? In fact, if they did, what would they need a union for?
Well, the Service Employees International Union is fighting very hard to unionize fast food workers. And what they're doing is funding groups such as Fight for 15, Jobs with Justice, and they're trying to unionize this segment of the workforce because there's very high turnover. Now, when you're a union, you don't just get union dues, which is a percent of the paycheck. You also get something called an initiation fee, which can range from $50 to $100 each time a new person is signed up. Well, in fast food, there's about 3 workers for every position annually, because someone takes the job for their summer, or they take it when they need a little bit of cash, then they move up to something else that's higher paying. So if you're a union, you want to unionize these jobs with high turnover, because instead of 1 initiation fee per year, you get 3 initiation fees per year.
What a deal.
Yeah, what a great deal. So instead of $100 a year from this one person, you'll get $300 from 3 different people. And that actually gives you more than the 2 to 4% of the paycheck in union dues in many cases. They want to unionize this workforce because of the initiation fees, and it's going to give them a big flow of money.
Very often when we look at these strikes against fast food places, the folks waving signs out front aren't even workers there. What's that all about?
These worker centers, such as Fight for 15 or Jobs with Justice, they are organizing these groups to come in and protest in front of the fast food chains. And I've received invitations myself because I'm on the AFL-CIO mailing list, email list. They've invited me to come and protest in front of Walmart. They've invited me to come protest in front of McDonald's. So they just get people on their email list to come and protest. And the percentage of people who are protesting who are actually fast food workers is very small. If it were larger or if it was substantial, then one would see these fast food restaurants closing during the strikes. But no, they all stay open.
When these organizations recruit people to picket, do they pay the minimum wage?
It's not clear how much they pay. Often they don't pay the minimum wage. They often don't pay $15 an hour, which is what they're protesting for. So you see these people protesting for $15 an hour wages in fast food restaurants, but they're not getting paid $15 an hour. And also the protesters aren't unionized either. So that's interesting. It's because these worker centers are allowed to do things that unions are not allowed to do. Unions have to file financial disclosure forms. They have to be voted in by their members. So these people organizing the strikes are not voted in by the people they purport to represent. In fact, if you were working for minimum wage and you were asking for a raise, you probably wouldn't ask for over 100% raise, because $15 an hour is more than 100% more than $7.25. You might ask for maybe 10 or 11 or maybe 8 or 9. So the whole thing is just a PR stunt.
Where did these worker centers come from? Have they been around a long time?
They've been growing over the past 5 years, and they've been around in some form or another for perhaps 10 or 15 years, some of them longer. But they've been growing ever since the unions have found out that President Obama was not going to deliver on some of his promises. I don't know if you recall, back in 2009 and 2010, there was a bill called the Employee Free Choice Act, which wasn't really free choice. It would have taken away the right of workers to a secret ballot in a union election.
Oh, was this the card check law?
That was the card check law, exactly, yes. And that didn't go through with a Democratic president, a Democratic House, and a Democratic Senate.
Why not?
Why not? Because representatives and senators knew that it was a bad law. I mean, they're not stupid. They got elected to Congress. And some of these other laws also, like the Paycheck Fairness Act, which wasn't fair, because it would have had the government interfere in the compensation decisions of firms and mandated that data be provided on men's and women's wages. And also cap and trade didn't go through. That's a bill that would have imposed limits on carbon emissions and required different states to trade and different industries to trade. So these bills that unions wanted just didn't go through in President Obama's first 2 years. So that's why they're turning to worker centers to try to move their agenda forward. They are limited in what they can do in demonstrations, but these worker centers are not. They are elected by workers. They have to file financial disclosure forms. These worker centers are not. So they have a lot more leeway as to what they can do. So what do unions do? They fund the worker centers, and the worker centers do the dirty work.
So, Diana, isn't it always in the Democrats' advantage to put these bills, these minimum wage bills, on the ballot? Because if they win, they look great. If a worker gets a raise, they look great. And if the worker gets fired and ends up on welfare, they end up voting Democratic, and it all works out fine. Why would they ever stop putting these on the ballot?
Democrats would probably try to put these on the ballot, but it's not always in the state's interest to have them on the ballot, because if your minimum wage gets too high, then companies aren't going to want to locate in your state, and you're going to find that diners or fast food restaurants, small enterprises that rely on fast food labor, close, and you're going to lose employment opportunities for your young people. So that's why it's not a good idea for states to pass these laws. And it might be a good idea for some people to have them on the ballot, Democrats to show what their power is. But in terms of what it does for the state, it's not a great idea. And you find in terms of politics, in terms of the federal minimum wage,
Mm-hmm.
that it's the states on the coast, California, New England states that have their own minimum wages already. They are trying to get an increase in the federal minimum wage
Right.
because what they want to do is they want to bring the Midwestern states without a minimum wage up to their level so that the coastal states are not at a competitive disadvantage.
So, Diana, last month you wrote a very interesting piece on the National Labor Relations Board changing the rules for franchising. And, we talk a lot about the fast food business. In particular, this article was talking about McDonald's. Bring us up to date on that, and what's the issue?
The issue is that all of a sudden the National Labor Relations Board General Counsel, Richard Griffin, has decided that the parent company, McDonald's USA, is a joint employer with the local fast food McDonald's restaurant. Up to now, in fact, for about 50 years, your employer has been the one who provided your essential hiring conditions, hired you, fired you, paid your wages, gave you vacation or sick leave. That's always been the definition of the employer.
Mm-hmm.
And in July, General Counsel Richard Griffin said, no, we are going to look at McDonald's USA as your joint employer. Now, people would say, why does that matter? Well, all of a sudden it means that when you sue your local McDonald's, you are also suing McDonald's USA. And that means all of a sudden suing your local franchise could bring you billions of dollars from McDonald's
pockets.
USA. But what's particularly interesting is that I called the NLRB. I called them to say, can you give me the legal justification for changing 50 years of precedent? And they told me, no, they couldn't. They told me, and I quote, the memorandum is not available publicly because it's part of the litigation process.
They made the law a secret.
They've made the law secret. So they told me they had written an advice memorandum with the arguments for why the law should be changed or the ruling should be changed, but they were not releasing it until the litigation. They weren't even releasing it then. They were using the arguments in their advice memorandum for their litigation against the franchise and against McDonald's USA, but they weren't even releasing the advice memorandum then.
But I'm confused. So if a case comes up, why can't McDonald's corporate say, I don't see the law that has relevance on us, we're not involved, step aside? Where do they even get the right to bring them into court?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but all I know is the NLRB is bringing them into court. The regional National Labor Relations Boards have a schedule of where they are bringing McDonald's into court, McDonald's USA and the franchise, and charging them both as joint employers with unfair labor practices.
And so this is not just McDonald's. This is Jiffy Lube. This is Dunkin' Donuts. This is anybody who has a national franchise organization all of a sudden has to worry about lawyers trolling at the local level for their deep pockets?
That's right, although so far the NLRB has only charged McDonald's. It hasn't charged anybody else. And you have to wonder, why are they just charging McDonald's? How can you have a law, which of course no one has seen because they're not releasing it? How can you have a law that just affects one company? Or is it going to be that the next time a Jiffy Lube is charged, then Jiffy Lube parent company is also going to be brought into court?
Is the SEIU involved in any of this?
The SEIU is not openly involved, but Richard Griffin, who's the general counsel of the NLRB, did have a union position before he joined that. He's had a large history of employers, of unions.
Employment. Diana, let's put the law aside for a while. Let's put economic efficiency aside for a while. Let's put economic growth aside for a while. And let's just worry about the morality of paying someone such a small amount of money. Doesn't minimum wage laws directly address that issue?
It's really interesting because President Obama says we have to raise the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour because that's who we are. We are not the kind of people that pay people $7.25 an hour.
Mm-hmm.
But with a minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, it costs an employer about $8 to hire somebody when you add Social Security and workers' comp and unemployment insurance. And it means if you have skills under $8 an hour, you are forbidden to work in the United States. President Obama wants to raise that to about $11 an hour. And the SEIU wants to raise it to about $16 an hour. It means if you have skills that are under $11 an hour, then you're not permitted to get a job. You're not permitted to work. And to me, that is immoral. That is un-American. That is not who we are.
You could always work off the books like I did when I was in high school.
You could, but the federal government has actually taken this into consideration. So if households have to depend on small amounts of money, who are really supported by someone who makes $7.25 an hour, we have the earned income tax credit, we have food stamps, we have Medicaid, we have housing vouchers. We have a whole group of benefits just to enable an employer to hire someone at $7.25 an hour and that person to be able to manage economically. Because Congress knew that if we raise the wage substantially, we are going to crowd people out of jobs. And everybody knows that if you pay somebody the average wage, which right now is $25 an hour, if I were to propose raising the minimum wage to $25 an hour, because after all, it's unfair to pay someone less than average, people would say, Diana, there would be people who wouldn't be employed at $25 an hour. Everybody gets this. What they don't get is that there are some people who aren't employed at $7.25 an hour. There are more people who wouldn't be employed at $10.10 an hour. And I can give you the example of Linda Mack, who owns Silver Cycles bike store in Silver Spring, Maryland. She has young teens at $7.25 an hour. They don't bring her a lot of money. In fact, she's doing a generous deed by training these young people until they can know enough about mending bicycles so they can actually do some good. When the minimum wage in Montgomery County rose to $8.50, and it's going to rise again next year, she had a real question as to whether she could continue hiring these young people and whether she has to move from a paid internship to an unpaid internship associated with a school as part of some educational program. So yes, there are some people who still get employed at $8, $9, $10, even $25 an hour. But we need to be concerned also about low-skill people in the economy who wouldn't be employed at a higher minimum wage. And it's increasing inequality if we don't allow poor people to work. President Obama is concerned about inequality. And if he's concerned about inequality, he should be encouraging low-skilled people to get jobs. But he's not if he wants the minimum wage raised.
You raise an interesting point that, we're a charitable society. Why not funnel our charity through charity and by that I mean government charity, like food stamps and like the earned income tax credit, rather than trying to funnel it through the payroll of companies?
Well, if we think that there's a problem and that low-paid individuals need more resources, then we should expand the earned income tax credit. We could expand it to singles or childless families, or we could expand it to upwards and give higher amounts of earned income tax credit. We could expand food stamps. But interestingly enough, the average household income of a minimum wage worker, according to the Census Department, is $52,000 a year.
Whoa.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
The average household income of a minimum wage worker with a teen minimum wage worker is $62,000 a year. The average household income of a household with a minimum wage worker who's not a teen is $42,000. These are not necessarily poor people. In fact, we have far more poor people than we have minimum wage workers. There are many, many more people who are poor, so increasing the minimum wage is not going to be a solution. We need to look at fundamental solutions, like if we want people to be earning $15 an hour, let's give them the skills so they can go out in the workforce and earn $15 an hour. Why are we, for example, saying that teens in urban communities have to go to failing high schools where the graduation rate is perhaps 60%? In the District of Columbia, average high school graduation rate is 59%, graduating in 4 years. We should allow kids and their parents to opt out of these failing schools. We need to get everybody a good education so that when they graduate, they qualify for one of these jobs. They can write, they can maybe use some computers, they can do some basic math. They're trainable so that they can qualify for a better paying job.
So now you're trying to fix our failing public education system. That really sounds like a bridge too far.
No, it doesn't, because really if you look at the amount people are paid, it is directly related to how much education you have. It's not a bridge too far. It's a direct correlation. You earn what you earn because of your education and experience.
So labor unions agitating to improve the quality of our public schools so that they'd have more educated workers?
No, they're agitating on the opposite side. They want to keep tenured teachers in place. They want to keep in place senior teachers who are not qualified and not allow the younger, more qualified teachers in. They're in favor of these rubber rooms in New York, where teachers are put on probation but still paid, still kept on the payroll, even though they're unqualified. Unions are firmly standing against contracts where people would be given a raise by merit instead of on the basis of seniority.
They're working the other side of the education fight, not the kids' side.
Right. They're working on the other side. They're absolutely against school choice. They're absolutely against merit-based raises, when everybody knows the only way you get a high-paying job is if you've had a good education. The only way you have a good education is if you have a good teacher.
A lot of employers are complaining that they can't hire low-skilled workers at higher wages because they'll lose money. Why don't they just move to automation?
Well, they are moving to automation. If you look at Chili's, it's moving towards having automated order boards where you can skip the server and you can just order on some kind of order board or iPad. More and more of these systems are being put in place. The problem is not what's going to happen to the employers. The problem is what's going to happen to the kids and low-skilled workers who need jobs. That's the real problem. We shouldn't be looking at this through the eyes of what's going to happen to the employers. We should be looking at it through the eyes of this teen who wants a job and he needs a reference for his next job, and how's he going to get that? That's the problem.
He can always go out and make a lot of money selling drugs.
I suppose that's one solution, but that's not the solution we want to encourage.
So, Diana, how do you see the minimum wage battle playing out over the balance of Obama's term?
I think it's unlikely that the federal government, that the Congress, is going to raise the minimum wage. I think that we're going to see more activity on a state-by-state basis. And that's positive, because if a state raises its minimum wage and then finds it's not able to compete with other states, then it has more leeway to pull it back than if Congress passes a general law. And I think also states should be looking at youth and teen exemptions from the minimum wage. So if a state's going to pass a minimum wage increase, it should say this is going to apply to people 22 and above. It's not going to apply to 22 and under. And that would enable young people to still enter the labor market, and that's what we need to be focused on.
Interesting. It would create a big incentive for teenage jobs, wouldn't it?
It certainly would, yes.
Diana, thank you so much for being on the show today. Please keep in touch.
It's great to be with you. Thanks so much for having me on.
That was Diana Furchtgott-Roth, Senior Fellow from the Manhattan Institute, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. That wraps up our show for this week. Listeners on Bloomberg Boston will notice that our broadcast schedule is changing to accommodate the launch of our program on Bloomberg San Francisco starting January 17th. Going forward, you can catch us Saturdays at 1 p.m. and again at 6 Eastern Time on WXKS 1200 AM and WJMN 94.5 FM HD2 in Beantown, and at 11 a.m. and 3 p.m. Pacific Time on KNEW 960 AM and KOSF 103.7 FM HD2 in Silicon Valley. See you then.